On the 18th of July, 2026, at a stadium in London, in front of 60,000 people, a runner from Edinburgh named Josh Kerr ran his last 400 meters in 54.9 seconds. And when he crossed that line, he erased something that had survived for 27 years. Think about how long that really is. That record was set in Rome in 1999 by a Moroccan named Hicham El Guerrouj. 3 minutes, 43.13 seconds. It survived the entire super shoe revolution. It survived 2 full generations of milers. And on the night it finally fell, the one man who had spent 3 years telling the world that this record belonged to him was not in that stadium. He was not retired. He was not banned. He was not even technically injured anymore. He was in Norway, rebuilding his training from almost nothing, 6 months after a surgeon opened up his left ankle and removed scar tissue from a piece of your body most people have never heard of, in places thinner than a millimeter. My name is Sebastian. I am a physical therapist and a performance analyst, and this is the Injury Breakdown. Today I'm going to show you 3 things. How Josh Kerr engineered a record that 27 years of technology could not crack. What that tiny sheath actually is, and why it let Jakob Ingebrigtsen run again just 23 days after surgery, and still leaves him unable to race 6 months later. And why the most glamorous event in all of track and field has quietly become a graveyard for Achilles tendons. Let me start with something that still does not sit right with me as a clinician. Josh Kerr did not stumble into this record. He announced it. 4 months in advance, he named the date, the meet, and the stadium. He gave the whole attempt a name. Project 222, 222 seconds. That was the target. Now here is the part that belongs on this channel and that almost nobody reported. When Kerr told the entire sport he was going to break the oldest record in middle distance running, he had not finished rehabbing his calf. He tore it at the World Championships in Tokyo in September of 2025. In the final he was defending. He spent weeks of that autumn doing the slow, boring, invisible work that every injured athlete watching this knows intimately. And somewhere inside that process, limping, not yet whole, he told the world the exact date he would make history. Who does that? Who calls a moonshot from inside a rehab room? Hold on to that question, because the answer explains how the race itself was run. His own training partner, Brandon Kidder, took him through the first 1,000 meters. Watch the laps: 55.3, 55.8, 55.4, and the final lap, 54.9. His fastest lap was his last lap. From the stands, alone at the front, he looked like a man barely surviving. His face said he was dying. The data says he was accelerating. And this is where it gets beautiful. In a mile at that speed, the chemistry inside a working muscle starts to collapse. Here's the simplest way I can put it. Imagine your muscle is a campfire, and lactic acid is the smoke. Run fast enough, and the smoke builds faster than the room can clear it until you can barely see the flames. Everybody, and I mean everybody, slows down when the room fills with smoke. That is what the last lap of a mile is. Kerr sped up. That is only possible for one reason. The first 3 laps were run just underneath his personal rate of collapse. Every 1/10 of a second he refused to spend early was a 1/10 his muscles did not spend destroying themselves. And the math proves it was deliberate. To break the record, he needed to average 55.45 per lap. He averaged 55.34. No lap faster than 54.9, none slower than 55.8. That is not a race. That is an equation with a heartbeat. Behind him, the American Yared Nuguse tracked him for 3 laps, could not hold the closing speed, and lost by 3 full seconds. Now, before I take you to Norway, I have to tell you the strangest thing in this entire story. He went deaf, not permanently. But during the world record, Josh Kerr lost his hearing. And it was not the first time. The same thing happened in the Olympic final in Paris. He has described the sensation as being outside his own body, watching himself run, while his legs produced splits they already knew by heart from thousands of repetitions in training. And look, when I first read that, my clinician brain lit up, because everyone wants the dramatic answer. So let me be honest about what we know and what we do not. Temporary hearing changes under extreme effort have been described in athletes. They are plausibly linked to a massive surge of the nervous system, and to blood flow being aggressively redirected toward working muscle. But I am not going to tell you the mechanism is settled in elite runners, because it is not. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. What is settled is the second half of what he described. It is called motor automation. When the brain is completely saturated by pain, your stride and your pacing stop being calculated and start being retrieved. The training becomes the autopilot, which means that at the exact moment Kerr broke a 27-year-old world record, he may not have fully heard 60,000 people screaming his name. Now let us go to the other side of this story, because it is much darker. The last time Jakob Ingebrigtsen raced, he finished 10th. 10th. In the 5,000-meter final at the World Championships in Tokyo, an event he had won twice. And days before, he had failed to even reach the 1,500-meter final. For a man with 4 world records, 2 Olympic gold medals, and a record 6 individual European golds, that was something closer to a public unraveling. And it had been building for over a year. It started in April of 2025, as discomfort in his left Achilles. He trained through it. He missed meets. He kept going. Then in January of 2026, it flared again, and he later said surgery had become, in his own words, 100% necessary. But here's the detail that changes how you should read everything that follows. Ingebrigtsen has said the injury did not just cost him training. It altered his mechanics, and it damaged his confidence in his own movement. Read that again. Not his confidence in winning, his confidence in moving. That is the part of injury nobody films. The best miler of his generation stopped trusting the way his own leg worked. So in February, he had the operation, and what happened next made no sense from the outside. 23 days later, he was running. 23 days, after a procedure that in other contexts can take the better part of a year. And yet here we are, 6 months later, and he still has not raced. His goal, in his own words, is to be back at 100% in 2027. So how does a man run 3 weeks after surgery and still be unable to race 6 months later? That contradiction is the scientific heart of this video. And it comes down to a distinction almost every headline in the world got wrong. Nearly every outlet called it Achilles surgery, and that is misleading. Your Achilles tendon does not sit loose inside your leg. It is wrapped in a thin sleeve of connective tissue called the Paratenon. Picture a bicycle brake cable inside its plastic housing. The cable carries the load. The housing lets it glide. The tendon is the cable. The Paratenon is the housing. When that sleeve becomes chronically inflamed, it thickens, scar tissue builds, and the tendon stops sliding cleanly and starts dragging against its own housing, thousands of times, every run. Now here is the clinical point that applies to a lot of you watching. Pain is not proportional to structural damage. You can have a fundamentally healthy tendon and a completely dysfunctional sheath. Ingebrigtsen himself said the tendon was sound. The surgery just removed scar tissue from around it. Nothing structural was repaired. A gliding surface was set free. And that is exactly why he could run at 23 days. There was no torn tissue waiting to tear again. So why is he not racing? Because running and competing at the highest level on Earth are separated by roughly 150 kilometers a week. And a tendon adapts to that on a biological clock that does not negotiate with anyone. It remodels through loading. Progressive, repetitive, tolerable stress that rebuilds collagen over months, not weeks. Tendon science is boring. It only understands time under tension. You cannot rush it, you cannot supplement your way around it, and you cannot want it badly enough. Which brings us to the cruelest irony in this story. This rivalry began in Budapest in 2023, when Kerr attacked with 200 meters to go and beat a sick Ingebrigtsen for the world title. The Norwegian's response was to describe Kerr as essentially just the next guy in line. He boasted he could beat him blindfolded. 3 years later, Kerr owns an Olympic silver, 2 world indoor titles, and now one of the exact records Ingebrigtsen wanted most, because Jakob had publicly stated that his goals for 2026 were the world records in the 1500, the mile, and the 5000. 2026 became the year he did not run a single race. The day after Kerr broke the record, Ingebrigtsen posted a training video. He mentioned neither Kerr nor the record, and he laid down one rule for the rest of his comeback. News about his fitness comes from him and nobody else. That is not silence. That is a man protecting the last thing he still controls. Now let me deliver on my third promise, because this is bigger than 2 athletes. Look at what the last 12 months did to men's middle distance. Niels Laros, 21 years old, the most electrifying young talent in the event, just shut down his entire season with an Achilles injury. Cole Hocker, the Olympic champion, lost 5 weeks this spring to a hip injury. Kerr tore his calf. Ingebrigtsen, surgery. Is that a coincidence? Look at the demands. A world record mile is run at over 25 kilometers per hour, with the foot on the ground for less than 150 milliseconds, and forces through the Achilles reaching several times body weight, stride after stride after stride. Your Achilles is not a rope. It is a spring. It stores and returns energy on every single step. But every spring on Earth has a fatigue limit, a finite number of loading cycles before the material itself begins to fail. Now add the modern context. These athletes train the volume of distance runners and race at speeds close to sprinters. And there is an open hypothesis in the literature, and I want to be very clear, this is a hypothesis and not a conclusion, that the rigid plates inside modern racing shoes may shift mechanical load toward the ankle and the foot. It is not proven. But the pattern of injuries at the top of this event deserves an answer, and right now the science does not have one. There is one more thing I have to tell you, because the history is too good to leave out. Josh Kerr is the 7th British athlete to hold the mile world record, and the first since 1985. That lineage runs through Roger Bannister, Sebastian Coe, and Steve Ovett. And Bannister is the one who belongs on this channel. Because when he broke 4 minutes in 1954, he was a medical student researching oxygen consumption during exercise. He ran himself on treadmills, breathing enriched oxygen mixtures, studying his own limits. The first sub-4-minute mile in history was, in a very real sense, run by an exercise physiologist experimenting on himself. And El Guerrouj's record survived 27 years and survived the entire super shoe era intact. Ask yourself why. That same technology cut minutes off the marathon record. It barely scratched the mile. Because over 3.5 minutes, running economy matters far less than raw aerobic power and your tolerance for acid. There is no foam on Earth that manufactures a VO2 max. So let us play the game this whole video has been building toward. What if Ingebrigtsen had been healthy on the 18th of July? His 1500-meter best is 3 minutes, 26.73. 4th fastest in history. Convert that into a mile, and you land somewhere in the low 343s, which means the record was within his reach. But not comfortably. And here is the twist. Kerr did not break this record simply because Jakob was absent. He broke it because he built an entire race designed to break it. His own pacer, his own splits, his own pace lights. Ingebrigtsen has always preferred to win races, not chase clocks. So maybe the real question is not who was faster. Maybe it is this. Would Kerr have gotten that record with Ingebrigtsen in the field? Because a rival forces you to race tactically. Running alone against a clock hurts far more, but it is ruthlessly efficient. Jakob's absence may not have handed Kerr this world record. It may simply have permitted it. And this story is far from finished. It's really only the first chapter. Birmingham in August will tell us something, but not everything. The real verdict lands next year, because Jakob Ingebrigtsen has named his own deadline, 2027, the year he says he'll be back at 100%. And the calendar could not have written it better, because that September, the World Championships come to Beijing, in the same Bird's Nest Stadium where records have fallen before. That is where this rivalry gets its honest answer. Not on a time trial with pace lights. In a final, head-to-head, with a title on the line. 6 years of accumulated Achilles damage against a man who spent the injury years collecting the very records Jakob wanted. So do I think Jakob comes all the way back? Here is my honest clinical read, and it is not the popular one. A chronic tendon that has been quietly compromised for years does not simply reset to zero when the scar tissue is cleaned out. The tissue can be freed, but the years of accumulated load leave a ceiling, and that ceiling is often just slightly lower than it used to be. In a sport decided by hundredths of a second, slightly lower is the entire story. Biology rarely forgives an overloaded tendon completely. That is my prediction. I genuinely hope he proves me wrong, because a healthy Ingebrigtsen chasing Kerr in Beijing might be the greatest race of the decade. Mark that date. And tell me below, do you think the tendon forgives him, or is the ceiling already set? I am Sebastian, and this has been the Injury Breakdown. If this pulled you in, you need to watch the one we did next door, called The Physiology Behind Norway's Endurance Machine. In it, we take apart 6 Norwegian bodies: Bjorn Daly, Johannes Klæbo, Marius Bakken, Jakob Ingebrigtsen, Christian Blumenfeld, and a cyclist you have never heard of, who recorded the biggest aerobic engine ever measured in a human being, and then walked away from the sport at the age of 20. Trust me, you do not want to miss that last one. I will see you there.